Morning, everyone. Morning. So, I'm going to speak to you on Lot, the reckless, to Lot, the righteous. And I think it's fair to say that as I was preparing for today, I had more questions than answers. Namely, why Lot? Why? But my prayer is that as we look at the story of Lot, there are lessons that we can all learn from our own lives. Just a slight disclaimer, there's no Sunday school today, so the children are in. So because of this story, there are a couple of times that, well, probably more than a couple of times, that I might just speak in code just to protect our children that are in a church. So hopefully you'll be able to follow me. So the story of Lot can be found in Genesis chapter 11 to 14 and chapter 19. He's also mentioned in the New Testament, but we'll come back to that at a later time. So first of all, who was Lot? Well, Lot was Abraham's nephew, and Lot's father, Haran, who is Abraham's brother, he died in Ur, leaving his two sons, Lot and Milcah, and a daughter, Iscah. Terah, who's the father of Abraham, Haran, and Nahor, moved his family away from Ur towards Canaan. But they didn't all make it there. They stopped at a place called Haran, and they settled there. So we pick this story up in Genesis 12, and this is where Abraham, or Abram as he was known then, received his call from God. The Lord had said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abraham went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abraham was 75 years old when he set out from Haran. He took his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out for the land of Canaan, and they arrived there. Do you know, it would not have been an easy journey from Haran to Canaan. They would have travelled about 400 miles to get there. I haven't got a map yet, but I'll pull it up in a minute. They'll travel about 400 miles to get there, and they would not have known what Canaan was like as a place. They really had to trust in God. Firstly, they settled briefly in Shechem. I think I've put the map in the wrong place because there it is. Firstly, they traveled to Shechem, where Abraham built an altar to God, and then they continued, surveying all the land so that Abraham decided they should travel. I'm missing my words up here, so. They basically surveyed all the land that God had given them. Then, when they were there, a famine hit the land. So Abraham decided they should travel down into Egypt and live as a foreigner. When he was sent packing later on from Egypt by Pharaoh because of the decisions that he had made regarding his wife, Abraham left Egypt having acquired a lot of wealth and livestock. They first went up to Negev and then on to Bethel. So we pick up the story again in chapter 13, where we see Lot and Abraham separate. Here we go. So Abraham went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abraham had become very wealthy in livestock and in silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier, and where he had first built an altar. There, Abram called on the name of the Lord. Now Lot, who was moving about with Abram, also had flocks and herds and tents, but the land could not support them while they stayed together, for their possessions were so great that they were not able to stay together. and quarreling arose between Abraham's herders and Lot's. The Canaanites and Perizzites were also living in the land at the time. So Abraham said to Lot, "Let's not have any quarreling between you and me, or between your herders and mine, for we are close relatives. Is not the whole land before you? Let's part company. If you go to the left, I'll go to the right. If you go to the right, I'll go to the left." Lot looked around and saw that the whole plain of Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the whole plain of the Jordan and set out towards the east. The two men parted company. Abram lived in the land of Canaan, while Lot lived among the cities of the plain and pitched his tents near Sodom. Now the people of Sodom were wicked and were sinning greatly against the Lord. The Lord said to Abram after Lot parted from him, "Look around from where you are to the north and south, to the east and west. All the land that you see I will give to you and your offspring forever. I will make your offspring like the dust of the earth, so that if anyone could count the dust, then your offspring could be counted. Go walk through the length and breadth of the land, for I am giving it to you." So Abram went to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron, where he pitched his tents. And there he built an altar to the Lord. So here we see Lot's first mistake. Both Abraham and Lot had acquired a lot of wealth and large flocks of animals. But because they had grown prosperous, the land that they were on could not support both of them. And this had led to quarreling and fighting. Was this the right thing to do, to separate? Could they not have sorted out the arguments? The Bible also tells us that the Canaanites and Perizzites were living on the land at the time as well. So the land could really not sustain all this farming going on, especially after the famine they'd just had. Abraham loved his family, and he didn't want the arguments. He wanted a place of peace. But instead of inserting his own right as the elder of the family, he trusted God and gave Lot the first pick as to which area he wanted to command as his own. Lot must have thought all his Christmases had come true at once. He should not have been given this choice as the younger member of the family, but when offered to him, he did not think twice. He didn't consult God, but as you see in verse 10, it says, Lot looked around. He saw the whole plain of the Jordan towards Zoar was well watered, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt. You see, Lot looked and he saw with his human eyes what he thought was good. A fertile land where life would be easy to farm. A land that reminded him of all those good times in Egypt where the abundance was plenty. This was a place where there was no famine and they had lived a good life. He could probably greedily see his wealth grow even more by choosing this land. You see, Lot wasn't a stranger to hardship. The journey from Haran to Canaan would not have been an easy one, and they would have encountered difficulties. And then he had also experienced the famine in Canaan, so maybe Lot was looking for that easy life. The trouble is, Lot was making an earthly decision, not a godly one. He had made this based on what he saw with his eyes as opposed to what God could see. He had a materialistic outlook and was not concerned with where God wanted him to be. And with this in mind, Lot decided to also settle near the cities of the plains and moved his tents near Sodom. Lot would have seen that being close to the cities would make his life easier for the markets and for trading. He would have known that Sodom was a wicked place, but he did not seem to give it any consideration. Abraham, however, had learnt his lesson from his mistakes in Egypt, and he allowed God to guide him. But Lot, who was even with him through that time in Egypt and had seen all the ramifications of the mistakes that Abraham had made, still selfishly chose what he thought would be beneficial to him. Basically, Lot chose for himself and God chose for Abram. The story goes on in chapter 14, where we see Lot captured by the Mesopotamian kings who had invaded Sodom and Gomorrah, as well as the other city-states in the area. Along with the people of Sodom, they took Lot and all that he owned. However, a herdsman escaped and informed Abraham of the situation. Abram did not think twice. He didn't think, oh, they've got a much bigger army. He just trusted God and knew that God would protect them. And he went and he rescued not only Lot, but all of Lot's possessions too. And then we read later that it wasn't just Lot that he rescued, but actually he rescued all the people of Sodom too. Abram didn't turn around and just say, I'm only here for Lot. No, he rescued everyone from the hands of the Mesopotamian kings. Now, this should have been a wake-up call for Lot. He should have realized that without God, our lives can crumble into insignificance. If it wasn't for Abraham rescuing him, then he would have lived out the rest of his days in captivity, owning nothing. However, after Abram rescued him, we could see that Lot seems to settle back in the very same place. And we could ask the question, why did Abram not warn Lot not to settle near Sodom? Why did he allow his nephew to live amongst such wickedness? Abram clearly sets standards for himself. On the way back to Hebron, after he had rescued Lot, he met two kings. One was Melchizedek, the king of Salem, who was a high priest of God. And the other was Bera, the king of Sodom. It's no surprise that their names have significant meanings. Melchizedek means righteousness. Bera means evil. We see in the Bible how Abram accepts Melchizedek's food and blessing. But when Bera, the king of Sodom, wants to bless him by telling Abraham he can keep all his blessings, all his possessions, we see Abram take a stand and rejects everything from Bera. And he says in verse 14, with raised hand, I have sworn an oath to the Lord, God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, that I will accept nothing belonging to you, not even a thread or the strap of a sandal, so that you will never be able to say, I made Abram rich. Abram clearly separates himself from wickedness here. Why, oh why, can Lot not see that this is what he should do? Instead, Lot settles back into the life he knew before he'd been captured. At the end of chapter 18, we see God confiding in Abram about his plans to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah because their sin was so grievous. But Abram, despite not liking what was happening, pleads with God. He pleads with God to save the righteous people who are living there. And he goes basically down from 50 down to even 10. And God agrees. We pick Lot's story up again in chapter 19, where two angels who had visited Abram, actually this is a funny thing, 3 angels visited Abraham, but only 2 angels then went on to Sodom, so I'm not sure what happened to the other one. But anyway, but two of the angels that had visited Abram arrive at Sodom. At some point, Lot had moved from living near Sodom to living in Sodom. He had a home there. His daughters were engaged to men of the city. He was rich. He was a prosperous man with flocks and herds. Some even say he was a leader in the city because he sat at the city gates, which is where all those with influence sat. But we don't know this for sure. We just know that he had some kind of authority or power in the city for him to be able to sit there. This place at the gate area was a place where important men of the city judged disputes, conferred with one another, or supervised those who entered and left the city. So Genesis 19. The two angels arrived at Sodom in the evening, and Lot was sitting in the gateway of the city. When he saw them, he got up to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. "My lords," he said, "please turn aside to your servant's house. You can wash your feet and spend the night, and then go on your way early in the morning." "No," they answered, "we'll spend the night in the square." But he insisted so strongly that they did go with him and entered his house. He prepared a meal for them, baking bread without yeast, and they ate. See, although Lot lived amongst all the wickedness that was occurring, he still knew God. He straight away recognized that the men who had arrived were men of God, hence why Lot had bowed his face down to the ground. Verse 4. Before they had gone to bed, all the men from every part of the city of Sodom, both young and old, surrounded the house. They called to Lot, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we can have S with them." I'm not saying it because of the children. Lot insisted on the angels staying with him to protect them and to try and get them out of the city as quickly as possible. He knew the wickedness of the place he was living in. Why was he there? Was he just tolerating it? Did he cry out to God to change these people? Did he think that as long as he wasn't joining in, that everything would be all right? Now, this next bit is really quite disturbing. Lot went outside to meet them and shut the door behind him. And he said, "No, my friends, don't do this wicked thing. Look, I have 2 daughters who have never slept with a man. Let me bring them out to you, and you can do what you like with them. But don't do anything to these men, for they have come under the protection of my roof." "Get out of our way," they replied. "This fellow came here as a foreigner, and now he wants to play the judge. We'll treat you worse than them." They kept bringing pressure on Lot and moved forward to break down the door. But the men inside reached out and pulled Lot back into the house and shut the door. Then they struck the men who were at the door of the house, young and old, with blindness, so that they could not find the door. As a parent, I stand here thinking, how on earth could you offer up your daughters to be abused, basically? It is completely unthinkable. It brings tears to my eyes now. It wasn't that he didn't love them, because it goes on to say they hadn't slept with anyone. So he clearly protected them while he was living in Sodom from the men that were there. But Lot clearly had misplaced loyalties and priorities here. He was trying to do right by God by protecting his angels and be loyal to the cultural code of the day that demanded you protect your visitors at all costs. What he forgot was 2 things. First was that the cultural code was just that. It was culture, and the culture in Sodom lacked any kind of morality. It was perverted, and so in his panic to save his guests, He reverted to the culture in which he was living. His solution was to drop his standards down to their level by offering his daughters to them. Secondly, God hadn't sent just men. God had sent angels. These angels were powerful, and Lot had forgotten this. He had forgotten that God could protect him and his household. And the angels did just that. Look at verse 10 to 11. The angels protected Lot and his family from the men of Sodom, not the other way around. This is another example of Lot trying to do things in his own steam and not depend on the faithfulness of the God in the situation. Last week, Johnson spoke about Hezekiah, and when we were looking at him, we learned that how actually in a time of crisis or difficulty, we can easily crumble. It's exactly in these times that we need to learn how to stand firm in our faith. The story then goes on to probably the most remembered part of the story, where Lot and his family escaped Sodom. So Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law who were pledged to marry his daughters, and he said, "Hurry and get out of this place, because the Lord is about to destroy the city." But his sons-in-law thought he was joking. With the coming of dawn, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Hurry, take your wife and your 2 daughters who are here, or you will be swept away when the city is punished." When he hesitated, the men grasped his hand and the hands of his wife and of his 2 daughters, and led them safely out of the city, for the Lord was merciful to them. As soon as they had brought them out, one of them said, "Flee for your lives. Don't look back, and don't stop anywhere in the plain. Flee to the mountains, or you will be swept away." But Lot said to them, "No, my lords, please. Your servant has found favor in your eyes, and you have shown great kindness to me in sparing my life. But I can't flee to the mountains. This disaster will overtake me, and I'll die. Look, here is a town near enough to run to, and it is small. Let me flee to it. It is very small, isn't it? Then my life will be spared." He said to them, "Very well, I will grant this request too. I will not overthrow the town you speak of, but flee there quickly, because I cannot do anything until you reach it." And that is why the town was called Zor. Zor just means small. By the time Lot reached Zor, the sun had risen over the land. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens. Thus, he overthrew those cities and the entire plain, destroying all those living in the cities and also the vegetation in the land. But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt. Here we see hesitation after hesitation. Firstly, the 2 men engaged to Lot's daughters did not believe him, and so they, along with the rest of the people in Sodom, perished. Secondly, when the angels told Lot to get out and to hurry, Lot hesitated to the point where the angels actually had to pull him out of there. Then we can see Lot hesitating again when he pleads not to go to the mountain, but to a small town instead. Here is a man who with his family has just been rescued from certain death. Yet even though the angels are guiding him to the mountains, he thinks he is going to die there. Finally, we read what is probably the most known hesitation of this story, as we see that Lot's wife turned back towards Sodom and then became a pillar of salt. So why the hesitations? Why not run with all your might to get away from this wicked place? You could say that he didn't realize the severity of the message the angels were telling him, but he himself had actually gone the night before to try to convince his future son-in-laws that they needed to leave. So maybe it was one of those situations where he wanted to close his eyes and wake up and realize it had all been a bad dream. The trouble was, Lot had actually had plenty of time to realize what and who he was living amongst. He had had plenty of opportunities to leave and move away from the place, and to recognize that the place was harmful to him and his family living there. But he had become too used to his surroundings and to living this rich lifestyle with all he owned. To run meant to leave all his earthly possessions behind. To run was to say goodbye to the life he knew. This is what happened to Lot's wife. She turned to look back at what she thought she was going to miss. This family had been so accustomed to Sodom for too long. I would like to think if I was in that situation, I would run and run and run and run, a bit like Forrest Gump, and not stop until I had reached that place of safety. But sometimes we just let things get a hold of us that actually are not right for us. Is there anything holding you back right now? Has anything got a hold of you that is stopping you? The story of Lot finally finishes in the mountains, the place that he had feared in the first place and didn't want to go to, but he ended up there because he became fearful living in the small town of Zoar. Why was Lot fearful? The angels had told him that Zoar would not be harmed. Was it that Lot did not trust fully what the angels had said? Was it that the people living in Zoar were sinful like the people in Sodom? Was it that Lot realized yet again that he had chosen the place to land and not God, and that actually he should go to the mountains where God had told him to go in the first place? We don't know the reason. We don't know how long even Lot lived in Zoar before moving on. But whatever reason, he ended up in the mountains. And yet again, we see the catastrophic results of not trusting in God. One day, the older daughter said to the younger, "Our father is old, and there is no man around here to give us children, as is the custom all over the earth. Let's get our father to drink wine, and then sleep with him and preserve our family line through our father." That night, they got their father to drink wine, and the older daughter went in and slept with him. He was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. The next day, the older daughter said to the younger, "Last night I slept with my father. Let's get him to drink wine again tonight, and you go in and sleep with him so we can preserve our family line through our father." So they got their father to drink wine that night also, and the younger daughter went in and slept with him. Again, he was not aware of it when she lay down or when she got up. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites of today. And the younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ami. He is the father of the Ammonites of today. Who's at fault? The daughters were the ones who seduced him when he was unaware. They plied him with wine and then slept with him. However, you could argue that Lot had allowed himself to get drunk. For Lot did not have a clue that they had slept with him, which means he was completely blind drunk. And this just doesn't happen once, but twice. In Galatians 5, it says, "The acts of the flesh are obvious. Immorality, impurity, debauchery, idolatry, witchcraft, hatred, discord, jealousy, fits of rage, selfish ambition, dissensions, fractions, and envy, drunkenness and orgies and the like. I warn you, as I did before, that those who live like this will not inherit the kingdom of God." What occurred in the mountains between Lot and his daughters was a direct result of living in a wicked place for so long, a place filled with all kinds of immorality. Lot might have protected his daughters from the men of Sodom, but both Lot's wife and their daughters would have seen what was happening in the place. They would have seen the people around them and the way that the people conducted their lives. So when they hit a rough patch and when they couldn't see a way forward in their life, they reverted to what they knew. Instead of trusting in God to sort it out, they took matters into their own hands. And look who their children end up being. The Moabites and the Ammonites, who were constantly at war with Israel. So, the first lesson: do not compromise God's standards in your life. Do not conform to the world or blend into it. When Lot separated from Abram, his intention would have been to honor God in all he did. But the moment Lot looked at the material wealth of the plains and didn't even consider the impact of living near a place like Sodom would have on himself and his family, he started on that slippery slope. He went from looking towards Sodom to pitching his tent towards Sodom to living in Sodom to becoming some sort of leader there. He probably didn't even realize that he was becoming more and more entrenched in the culture of the place and the effects that this was having on his family, even agreeing for his daughters to marry men from there. Think how much the culture had impacted him for him to offer up his daughters to the men in the village instead of the visitors who were staying. Don't compromise God's standards in your life. Don't look at outside influences and what the world does to set your standards, but base your life on what Christ wants for you. The church is a clear example of how, or the church today, I should say, is a clear example of how we have let culture have a voice in our church. Not particularly our church, but I'm talking the church generally. As Christians, we are meant to be the salt and light on the earth. However, there are many, both within the church and establishment and outside of the church too, who are trying to change not only people's ideologies and moral stance, but also that of the churches too, in order for churches to fit in with the culture and the ideologies and the moral standards of the day. Allowing others to dictate and influence our moral compass and that of the church is a very dangerous position to be in. We lose our saltiness, our distinctiveness. Our light dims or becomes extinguished. Last week, we discussed whether God changes or not and came to the conclusion that God does not change. Therefore, if God does not change, then why should how God tells us to live our lives change? It doesn't. Just because others find something acceptable in today's culture does not mean that we have to agree with it. There is a verse in Judges 21 which says, all the people did whatever seemed right in their own eyes. We need God to guide us more and more in the decisions we are making and make sure that we are not compromising his standards to fit in with today's society. I was speaking to a friend recently and we were saying that one thing that's hardly talked about in churches today or is just deemed as acceptable nowadays is people sleeping together or living together before they get married. If Christians turn around and say they are celibate, they get laughed at. They're in the minority. God's standard is that he intends for a man and woman to be intimate in marriage. What is portrayed in society, in the culture that we live in today, is that sex is just an act and it's often meaningless and just pleasurable. A 2018 survey found men reported having an average of 26 partners before settling down. For women, the average was 19. I'm sure that's probably even higher now. And it's affecting children younger and younger. There's a lobby trying to bring in such teaching into school from such a young age just because they have an agenda to push. We need to take a stand as believers in God. We need to be aware of the harm these teachings and wrong ideologies can have on our children. We need to live by God's standard and not let culture dictate what we believe and think. So what is the Sodom and Gomorrah in our lives today? Let's consider the world we live in right now. We live in a society that seems to have lost any sense of what is right and wrong. We live in a place where having faith in God is a rarity. People would rather live each day doing what is right in their eyes rather than putting their trust in God. We live in a country where our leaders have lied, cheated, stolen, and broken their own rules. We have heard countless stories from both the world and, unfortunately, from churches too, where there is immorality occurring, abuse occurring, and exploitation of children and vulnerable adults. We live in a society where social media has so much influence over what people look like, over the way people dress, over the way people behave, and over the way that people respond. Do we look for easy ways to live and make money, but never question the route to get there? None of these changes happen suddenly in our lives, but they gradually seep into our lives, sometimes without us being aware, until it becomes the norm. Although we live in a sinful world that hates God, we are not conformed to this world, but by God's grace, we are transformed by the renewing of our mind. That's from Romans 12:2. We need God to transform and renew our mind. Secondly, what do you value in your life? Think about who you spend your most time with. Think about how you spend your most time. Whether you like it or not, this will also influence you greatly, even if you try hard not to let it. Let me give you a simple example. At the moment, I am preparing the Year Sixes for their end-of-year production. We are doing Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. I am doing this show so much that it has become ingrained in my mind. I go to sleep singing the songs in my head. I wake up singing the songs in my head. I don't want to, but this is what is in my head. And it's not a wrong thing to wake up singing, there's one more angel in heaven. It's not a bad thing. But I'm trying to show you that actually what we're spending our time on really gets in there. All of us can be influenced by outside factors, especially those we spend our time on or time with. We are not immune to it. We see the impact in Lot's life and how this played out in his entire family. In Proverbs 13:20 it says, "Whoever walks with the wise becomes wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm." Lot suffered a lot of misery and pain in his life due to the companionship of those he kept. It might have grieved him to live there, but he became so complacent with it instead of running away from it. Third thing, learn from the mistakes you make. We see countless times that Abraham made mistakes in the choices he made, pretending Sarah was his sister or sleeping with Hagar, but because he couldn't believe a child would actually come from Sarah. However, Abraham always looked to God and he trusted in the promise that God had made to him. This saw him go into battle to rescue Lot against the Mesopotamia kings and saw him take a stand against the king of Sodom by refusing any gift from him. Lot did not seem to take warning from his mistakes, even if after he had chosen that land, when he saw the wickedness of what it was really like, he should have run a mile. Even after he was rescued by Abraham, why go back there? Unfortunately, sin has a way of getting us tangled and trapping us. And I believe this is what happened to Lot. Hebrews 12:1-2 says, therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles, and let us run with perseverance the race marked out for us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. We can see here in that passage, sin so easily entangles. We know from 2 Peter 2 that Lot was tormented in his soul with the sin of the place, but he didn't do anything about it. He had taken his eyes off God and had his eyes on the land and on his possessions. We need to learn to see what God sees for our lives and keep our eyes firmly fixed on him, learning from our mistakes. Your choices will directly impact those you love and the generations coming behind you. We see the ramifications of Lot's choices, not just in Lot's immediate family, but also in the generations to come, and how the decisions that he made had a lasting effect. The Moabites and Ammonites were at war with Israel for a long time. It wasn't Lot's daughters who had chosen to grow up in such a place of wickedness. That was Lot's decision. He should have protected them more and realized the consequences that living in such a place would have on his wife and children. When we make wrong choices, we need to come back to God and put our feet on the right path. As parents, we need to guide our children. We need to have a positive influence in their lives. We don't always get things right. In fact, we often find ourselves saying the wrong things or doing the wrong thing. But our priority as parents should be to love and to protect our children as much as possible. I think one of the hardest things as a parent is when we see our children making mistakes. We need to come alongside them. We need to guide them. Sometimes they will listen. A lot of the time, they don't. And sometimes they need to be allowed to make their mistakes in order to learn from them. I think as a parent, this is probably the hardest thing to do, and something that I know I have struggled with greatly. But this is what God does with us. He's our Father, and he allows us time and time again where we make mistakes. So we need to trust that God is in control when it comes to our children. And we need to make sure that we are following what God wants for us. Don't be afraid to let go and trust God. Lot became afraid of change, afraid God wouldn't protect him, afraid of being in a new place. He had started this journey with Abram, not afraid of God's provision in his life. He didn't know what Canaan was like or how they would survive the journey, but he trusted God. However, once there, he became too comfortable. He probably enjoyed the privileges of becoming wealthy, not having to worry about money or food. That is, after all, why he chose this area to dwell in, a land like Egypt. Prosperity is something that can catch all of us out. We want to be secure. We want to be comfortable in the way that we live our lives, not having to worry about money or where our next meal is coming from. But this also takes away the reliance on God. When the Israelites were in the desert, they had to rely on God for food each day. There was something that held Lot in this place of wickedness, even when the angels were telling him to hurry. He had to be dragged out. Abram let go and trusted God to make the decision over where he should live, and it came as a blessing to him. When we step out of the way, God blesses us abundantly. we can trust God to take care of all our needs, even when it seems that others are helping themselves to the things that are ours. And finally, God sees the heart of man. So if this is the end of Lot's story, then how can we call the title of this sermon, Lot the Reckless to Lot the Righteous? I mentioned earlier that Lot's mentioned in the New Testament. We find him written by Peter in 2 Peter 2. He says, "And if he rescued Lot, a righteous man, who was distressed by the depraved conduct of the lawless, for that righteous man living among them day after day was tormented in his righteous soul by the lawless deeds he saw and heard." You know, you could argue that Lot was rescued because of Abram's righteousness, because Abram had righteousness credited to him by faith, and Abram had called out to God to save Lot. But in this passage, we see clearly that Peter was referring to Lot himself as righteous. How can a man who made so many bad choices for himself and his family be called righteous by God? You see, Lot was righteous not because he acted perfectly, but because God saw his heart. His heart was for God. He might have taken some wrong turns along the way and did not live a very outwardly righteous life, but he believed in God by faith, and God counted that faith as righteousness. We too will make countless mistakes in our lifetimes, but God calls each and every one of us righteous. Not because of our faith like Abram and Lot, because this was under the old covenant, but because of Jesus. No person can be proclaimed righteous by themselves, but all who are found in him are declared righteous. 2 Corinthians 5 says, "For he made him who knew no sin to be sin for us, that we might become the righteousness of God in him." Our righteousness, the very reason we can stand before him today, comes from Christ alone.